So thank you for joining this session with me and Benson and Julia Robinson to discuss narrative adornment and metamorphosis, unpacking the rich textures and layers within their storytelling, not only connecting the links between their practice, but also their experiences in the year that has been 2020. Rather than introducing Liam and Julia through their bios, the artists will walk us through their practice, showing some images and highlighting their key works. So I'm going to start by thanking Julia and Liam and inviting Liam to kick off the chat.
Thank you. Lovely to be here with everyone today. I'm joining you from Barramadigal country, which is part of the Darug Nation, and I extend my loving respect to Darug elders of the past and present, and all the elders who continue to carry and care for culture in the places that we are all existing on. So I'm just going to share screen, some images of my work. So I'm a performance artist, but I also work with textiles and community. And my practice originally was really focused on unpacking identity and talking about how community, culture, place, family contribute to identity, and how all those elements speak to one another. Particularly, one of the prominent aspects of my identity that I was looking to explore and unpack was my queer identity, and particularly how that spoke to and informed who I was, as you know, yeah, because I guess it's an ongoing question and something, you know, part of the queer experience is, you know, the questions that we carry throughout our life is, you know, what does it mean? What does it mean for me? Where do I fit within my community? Yeah, and that has been an amazing experience, and I think of it as a skill, as a life skill that I'm able to use to navigate the rest of my experience, and also a way to connect with people. So this is the Opal Queen, which is a work that I made about the matriarchy of my family, my mother and my grandmother, and my sister, and I was also cross-referencing the monarchy, the British monarchy, which my mother and grandmother was Scottish, so culturally the Queen played quite an important role in our family, and yeah, so yeah, my work is performatively is quite playful, often has a sense of humour to it, and yeah, brings together, I guess, all the different maybe seemingly unrelated elements together. And yeah, I guess I always like to think of them as a question. As well as the beautiful things that inform, you know, who we are, I also want to look at, you know, the other power structures that inform identity, and that includes, I guess, the system of colonialism that I have grown up in and I live as part of, you know, as a way to question and critique my privilege as a white person and as a white male. And again, you know, I think that my queer voice, my queer identity is something that is supporting me in navigating that and rethinking that and challenging those power structures. Again, for me, it's very much an ongoing series of questions. So I've been turning to my materials recently, sequins and beads, which quite frankly, I'm just obsessed with. And really enjoying the process and the laborious amount of time that I get to spend with these materials and the amount of thinking space that it gives me. And also as a material, you know, sequins are one of the, like, using my body, using me can be a confronting thing, especially because I use the gaze in my work, and some of my works are deliberately confronting and provocative, whereas sequins are really unthreatening. So I found it as a great medium to continue the dialogue and discussion around pertinent political concerns that affect us all. And I've been using it as well, just to enter into the subjects a little bit more delicately and lightly. And I've been sharing the process too. The sequence for me are about thinking, process, celebration, and sharing. So this is a community-made work titled Community Participatory Embroidery, You and Me. And I made it over 5 years with over 100 people with, of all different experiences, cultural backgrounds and abilities. And we would spend time looking at the language map of First Nation Australia, to spend time with it, to think about it, to acknowledge it and its diversity, and our connection to this representation of this body of land as well. And whilst sewing and embroidering, it was a lovely space to share stories and connect with one another. So I took it to schools, art galleries, community spaces, existing communities who I visited. And I taught people how to, my humble way of sewing beads and sequins, and together we pieced that work together. I also did a series of flowers that were about memory and loss, and how culturally flowers are quite a common symbol, and play a common role in ceremony and memory. I remember also, I love these mass floral tributes from when Diana passed away, to I guess terrible things that we experience, terrible events that people pour their soul at, and reach out to others with a gesture of flowers. So these were all made by many people, again, about 100 people. And this was really nice because a lot of the flowers were never really finished. So somebody else would pick it up and finish it for them. So there was this lovely exchange between people. This was one of the participants and her mum. It was great as well because there's actually no right or wrong way to sew a bead and sequin. And so that was really nice for me as well, as a perfectionist, because I was taught, I guess, through taking costumes apart, but also taught by my mother, who was a maker as well. And so this is the final piece. So I've been working for the past 6 years with a community group, a collective of artists from here in Western Sydney, and we all share a love of making. And this collective is called Adorned. And this is from our first series that it was a project that I facilitated, where I just called out, I said, who loves making things and who wants to make wearable art? And this wonderful group of humans came together, and we've been working together ever since. So you can see everyone's wearing something that they made that carries a story. And we exhibited these as a series of photographic portraits. The next year, to take it to the next step, we made new wearable pieces and realized that there was a really amazing performative element to it. So we created, we performed at a local festival, Paramasala Festival, which is a cultural festival here in Parramatta. And then we also shot a video. So these are some stills of some of the performers wearing their pieces. We made a film called Wisdom, Memory and Song, which was a way for people to activate their costumes and elaborate on the stories that they were telling through their materials, through their techniques. The group is really culturally diverse, and recently is incredibly gender diverse as well. So just so happened women were responding originally to the call out, but now there's a really diverse range of genders in the group as well. And so lastly, I've got a little commission to share with you. Last year, I did the Bella Room commission for the Museum of Contemporary Art. It's an artwork that is tactile and interactive. And I drew on my love of horses and my growing up on Darug country here in a rural part of Sydney. Also drawing on drag culture and costume to create a series of wearable pieces made of fringe that I thought of as like horses' manes. And also this room with this giant spectrum mane. And there's also a video of horses in slow motion. And this work it turned out to be really about non-verbal communication and how dance and movement is a way of communicating, and how tactility is a really significant language for us as well, and colour. And so one of the important key elements that informed this work was thinking about folk art, folk culture, and working with fringe again as this common, simple texture that can be used in a variety of ways and activated in a really person-centered way. Sometimes it was about touching, and sometimes it was about you shaking and being activated by the fringe. And so this artwork is for everyone, but it really tapped into young people, children and families, and also people with varieties of physical and mental experiences and access requirements as well. And so that work is touring to Orange Regional Gallery soon, where we'll also be working with Writing for Disabled. And that's Cisco at Writing for Disabled here in Box Hill, which is also on Dora Country. So I worked with community there to really learn about horses and how people and horses communicate together as well through non-verbal communication. Yeah, so that's it for now. Hopefully I'm still keeping with time.
Thank you so much, Liam. That's such a rich practice that you have, and I can't wait to have a dive into a conversation with you. I'm looking forward to Julia's voice in that conversation as well, so perhaps this is an opportune time to hand over to Julia to also do a screen share and unpack parts of her practice too.
Cool, thanks Debbie, thanks Liam as well, that was fantastic. Yes, I'm also presenting like Debbie and Guildhouse today in Adelaide on Kaurna land, so I'd like to extend my respects as well. I'm going to grab my screen share up and pop my PowerPoint on, and I've just, like Liam, put together a series of images to give some context for today's talk, and I focused primarily on just a few works over the last 5 years, just the last recent 5 years, that have particularly addressed notions of adornment and have kind of talked a little bit to the way that I engage with kind of bodies or body parts. And these works that for me speak in my broader practice to my ongoing engagement and fascination with rituals or ceremonies that are related to the cycle of the seasons, life and death cycles, and symbols of fertility and metamorphosis. So I chose these particular works because even though they're fairly recent, these are from 2015, these were the first pieces where I really started to bring the idea of costuming adornment really loudly into my practice. Even though I've been sewing in my practice for 20 years, since my honours year, I hadn't really engaged with costume per se. I'd been just sort of working with textiles in various other ways. And really 20 years ago when I started sewing in my practice, my sewing as a hobby just stopped. You know, I stopped making clothes for myself, and I never really showed much more interest in that, and it all became about how it was integrated into my studio practice. So these recent works are the first time I really started to engage with sort of notions of adornment and this idea of sort of ritual and folklore. These yellow silk works were the first sort of pops of colour that had been in my practice for about 15 years, where I really sort of wrenched it into this kind of colour palette and started to refer more overtly to ceremonial costume traditions and evoking ritual through the garment itself, or sort of suggesting narratives through the ritual garments of my own kind of devising those. So they're sort of based on real things, but coming through my own lens, which is how I process things in the world. And then there's a series of works that followed those yellow ones where I brought into play the gourd. There's a couple of gourds hanging in the background there. And I particularly sort of latched onto this strange fruit, partly because it's a symbol that resonates with fertility and procreation, the phallus, good fortune, And it sort of was a way for me to engage with a bawdy sense of humour in my practice, but also to talk about more serious things to me, like entering into dialogues around sort of my concerns around, well, as in like my human concerns around sex and death and life and death and fertility, and what that sort of means to think about growth and decay as part of the natural cycle of things, and how we navigate that as humans, but particularly how we navigate that through ritual and ceremony, which is my real kind of area of interest. So again, with these, the idea of costuming was sort of a signifier of ceremony or importance, and it was me bringing a sense of sort of decadence and a kind of self-conscious pompousness to the work by sort of overtly adorning the gourd, and, you know, overtly sort of celebrating in these works the phallic properties, but also celebrating the vegetal or new life from decay and metamorphosis. And at this time as well, I particularly introduced these Elizabethan costume techniques, which is one of my favourite eras of costuming. So introducing this technique called smocking, which is this really laborious, hugely materially consumptive technique of hand sewing. And that's what this sort of, that detail there shows, the kind of honeycomb smocking. And it became this kind of luxurious signifier as well. This sort of language of excess and adornment that overemphasizes parts of the body, but also, you know, I love the way that costuming in particular, the Elizabethan era is sort of, it's full of sexual signifiers as well, and kind of bodily signifiers. It's, you know, orifices and linings and undergarments and shirts and skirts and sleeves kind of opening out and revealing kind of interiors. And I really like that kind of play off of it just being, being kind of fabric and wearable, but also kind of bodily at the same time. And following on from the gourd bodies of work, I was in this show in the MCA in the National in 2019, and I'd been fastidiously kind of staring at the Hieronymus Bosch Garden of Earthly Delights painting, and thinking I wanted to make a work that felt like the way that painting felt to me, sort of rich with diversity and metamorphosis and kind of these rich, fruity sort of textures. And I eventually landed on the fact that I would derive the kind of components that I was making from the actual composition of the image. So these kind of strange fruit-like spiky forms kind of grew out of that painting and became these more sort of physical forms that to me speak again to extravagant ritual, or sort of fruits that are bursting apart, the idea of metamorphosis, and bringing into place a language of kind of flesh pinks and bruised blues, and a kind of palette that sort of talks to inside seeping out, or skins breaking down or opening up. And this for me, I sort of noted when Liam talked about his perfectionism, this for me, leaving a raw edge or like cutting into material is like such an anomaly. It's like a real wrench for me to handle that. I really wanted to do that. I really wanted to try something new, but these cut edges and these seams showing are really, they took a lot for me to go there in the work, and I really wanted to sort of try that. But the idea of these kind of things opening up. And then I just jumped to the last few slides here of my most recent work, because that's sort of the last thing I've really made for a while, Beatrice, which was shown at Monster Theatres. And, you know, Beatrice really is this kind of conflation of a lot of things, all those things I've been thinking about for a while. It sort of feels like a resolution of sorts of a number of those concerns. But she is this kind of crazy hybrid creature, derived partly from, you know, Lee Robb's curatorial premise of the monster, but also from my engagement with the Museum of Economic Botany, and thinking about this text that I read called Rappaccini's Daughter, about a toxic plant woman who lives in this contained in this garden, and she can't touch anything without it decaying. But I wanted this sort of strange, monstrous form with a kind of, I guess, a kind of tight skin that's sort of intended to hover between the idea of growths or cuts or splices or mutations, and this sort of, for me, this beautiful creature, even though she sort of could be categorized as a kind of classical monster or sort of derived from that, she's this sort of beautiful thing that's kind of moving and growing and changing all the time. And sort of wanted to bring all those kind of concerns together in this work, and a lot of techniques that I've been working on for a few years were kind of brought to a resolution in this work, and sort of found a particular form that I'm now sort of moving into other things. So yeah, that's my slideshow and my little touch on that. So
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So incredible to see both of your works and to have your voice as you're presenting them. It's really lovely to hear some more insights behind them. There's so many shared approaches between the both of your practices, from costuming to storytelling to labour, so much labour, to folk. And I'm trying to figure where we start with this. But mainly I'd love to start with folk, because when we spoke last week, we had a little revelation where we revealed that Julia had refound a connection to folk dancing, and that had a really lovely connection to Liam. But there's so many, there's so much texture and colour and storytelling within folk, and I wonder, Julia, if you can tell us if that was a starting point for you in your practice, do you think?
Yeah, it actually, I've always processed things through the lens of folklore and storytelling. I've never considered myself a writing storyteller. I'm not a particularly good writer in that sort of creative sense. So I've always thought about my sculptural practice as being my form of storytelling, and deriving from just like my whole life of reading fairy tales and folk tales, and I love looking for the connections across different cultures, where you find those kind of moments that exist in different kind of parts of the world, and there's this sort of lovely shared stories or shared narrative devices, and or shared rituals and ceremonies as well. You sort of see the same things recurring around, but it's just always my go-to thing. It's always to process how I process the world through this language of folklore and storytelling. And I'm sort of an avid sort of voracious reader of folk tales from everywhere, and finding really sort of nuanced stories, and really getting into that. And now the folk dancing is sort of feels like an extension of that, really, because so many of the folk dances that I do from sort of Eastern European area is they all have these stories attached to them, and I just love when I'm being taught these new dances. I love hearing about the way that they relate to stories, and I can see that as being an extension of my practice as well.
And Liam?
Yeah, I think the thing that I love the most about folk culture and folk stories, folk art, folk dancing is that, there leaves space for different versions, and particularly with folk stories, I love how sometimes there are like darker versions, or culturally specific versions, or it might be that might be affected by place or location or community, and yeah, it's come into my work as a focus, and I'm talking about it thanks to the Bella Room. But it too, I realised, had been a big part of my growing up as well, because being my mother being Scottish, I realised that a lot of my cultural identity came from her, and from my grandmother and my grandfather. That my dad contributed to it as well. He was identified as a Queenslander, but he kind of adopted Scottish culture as well, and had his Highland gear. But yeah, like we would go to Scottish balls growing up, and I played in the pipe band. I was a side drummer, but I just, the most amazing memories of dancing Strip the Willow with my family. It makes me emotional talking about it, but it's a good emotional, and I remember the way that my grandfather and my grandmother danced that, and they were, little beautiful elderly people, but my grandfather would practically, was, picking my grandmother up off the floor as they spun around and whooping, and it's really exciting when you get people together in a notion of celebration and sharing. And I guess that's something that I'm really looking to tap into in my work, and find other ways to expand on that. Because in unpacking identity, and we live in this world today where we're very focused in on ourselves, thanks to the internet and our media and phones, and I think politically as well, there's so much division, and there's a lot to unpack, and that needs to be done in the right way. But also at the same time, I think it's really important to come together and to share and to listen to other people's versions of a story and see, you know, how do you move, how do you dance, and you know, what did you learn from your parents and grandparents, and that you still choose to carry today, and that inform who you are in a really in a myriad of ways and subtle ways, and really forward-thinking ways, and also ultimately, how is it informing the way that you interact with and process the world? I think that's something that's really interesting with folk culture too.
Thank you, Liam. I feel like, Julia, that's something that you might see within your practice as well, being that you've recently returned to folk dancing and you've reconnected with the whole community. And particularly this year, I think there's quite an action to community as a form of resilience, and community might not be prevalent in your everyday practice in the same way that it might be for Liam, but I feel like there's a broader community that really is to play with you as well, Julia.
Yeah, that's true. And you know, with this unusual year we've experienced, the art community has been so important to me. But you're right in the sense that the way that I you know, I consider myself an incredibly sort of solitary, studio focused artist, in the sense that I really do go to, you know, a studio on my own every day, and I'm in a group studio, but we sort of keep to ourselves, and we sort of respect each other's working sort of patterns and ethics. So I do process the world a lot on my own through these kind of vicarious interactions with community. So through literally just through the research that I do into rituals and community ceremonies, and particularly European and British ones, which also reflects my my cultural background. My parents were both British, so I have this kind of this innate pull towards those particular kind of regions for ceremonies and rituals, although I do sort of look broadly as well. But yeah, this return to folk dancing that I started, you know, when I was a kid, and the group disbanded 20 years ago, and I've rejoined. And it's the same group, so some of the people are still there that I know, including one of the Marina, who's a friend of Liam's from the adornment group. So yeah, this kind of reconnecting with that has been really interesting for me, because it is probably the most community kind of engaged activity I do, and I see this really interesting relationship to my practice that I haven't yet formed a way to kind of activate in the practice just yet, but I know it has great potential in there. But I was saying to you, as you know, last week, that it's what I really love about it is this might be the only time in my life pre-COVID that I would get together with, you know, 20 adults, and we would all hold hands in a room, and that feeling I get when I'm dancing and everyone's, you know, I'm focused on the steps, but I can sense the whole room moving in the same way, and I can feel the feet around me moving, and this sort of embodied knowledge that we have together. It activates something in me that I think had been lost or dormant for so long, and it so energizes me, and it's a really nice counterpoint to my very solitary studio life that I still really love and really get energy from. But you know, once a week when I do the folk dancing, I get this different form of energy that feeds into my practice notionally. So yeah.
And Liam, how has community worked for you this year in isolation? How have you been able to connect with people and continue your practice, which seems so collaborative in so many ways?
Well, it's been great because we have all realized the potential for increasing our access and reaching out to people and working online. And for a while there, as much as that's been great, we know we're all also really missing each other when social restrictions were at their tightest. But that's okay. You know, because we all had more time to sit at home and make the things that are piling up all of our projects. But I don't know, actually, when the restrictions lifted, we quickly went back to kind of feeling normal. And I'm cautious about how I say that, because I know that other people in the country have had very different experiences and have experienced terrible isolation. And but there was just a real sense of enthusiasm to get back in. And luckily, you know, I have this space here, which is supported by Parramatta Council. It's part of the Parramatta Artist Studios. And so one of the things that was my main focus in having a studio was to be able to share that with local community. And you know, I love being in here on my own, and you know, Julie and I both, we need a lot of time with our work, but it just, in the same way that Julie's talking about getting together and holding hands with people and moving around a room in a space, I need that same thing as well, you know, once a week or once a fortnight, for just people to fill this room, and for all my materials for people to look at them and talk about them and use them and share them, and you know, just for all of us, it brings the things that we work with a new and deeper significance, because when you're on your own, you love the materials that you work with, but sometimes you might overlook something, or you only looking at that material or that process in one way, and then you get talking to somebody else and they will highlight something about it that you hadn't noticed. Or I guess, you know, the sharing of techniques is so essential, because it's really hard actually to make yourself try new things with materials on your own. You've really got to sit yourself down and force yourself to do it. But when you're with a group of people, it's lovely how it happens over time, in subtle ways, and as also facilitated ways. So I guess that's the biggest value of sharing space, and making a community moment of sharing.
Both of you really share such strong narrative storytelling within your works, and I'm wondering how you came to develop that. I think that's the such a pivotal thing for an artist, and the most difficult thing to do. How did you come to have confidence within your narrative and find that direction? Was there a connection to folk, do you think, that helped foster that because you were so used to being around storytelling, or was there a particular mentor that helped you define? To both of you, and you're on mute, Liam.
Yeah.
Yeah, cool.
Julie, do you want to chat first about that?
Yeah, I feel like it's just always been in me in a way. I think I just was really lucky. I grew up with a lot of books around me and a lot of storytelling, and my parents were really, really engaged with that and wanted me to be really engaged with that. So it took hold very early on, and then I just sort of fostered it myself. I can't really think of a particular person who sort of particularly inspired it, but I guess because I said before, you know, I don't see myself as a particularly accomplished creative writer. I look to materials as the kind of words that I work with, and the kind of the textures and the qualities that come out of that. I feel like that's my sort of that's my kind of raft of storytelling kind of cues and skills, and I gravitate towards objects. I'm very tactile. I sort of thought for a little while when I was at art school I might have been a painter, which was sort of just an idea I had, but I quickly realized that I was actually a sculptor, and when I look back now at the things I made as a kid, I was clearly going to be a sculptor because I was always making things. I wasn't really a drawer as much as I was a maker. So I think in terms of that fusion of storytelling, or that fusion of kind of reading stories and wanting to tell stories myself, but looking for the way that I can do it and the way that feels most comfortable for me is through these tactile materials and bringing those things together as the narratives. I'm not sure if that answered the question, but it does. Pieces of the puzzle, I guess. But yeah.
You learn through material, or talking through material.
Yeah, that's how I communicate, I think, and how I feel most comfortable is touching things and moving them around and manipulating them, and those become my sort of paragraphs and my sentences, if you want to draw an analogy to that.
Yeah, totally. There's such an amazing, powerful language within what we work with and how we use them. I really feel that too, and for me, I think the defining moment was when era was like age 17, 18, starting to go into the city and go to gay and lesbian nightclubs and spaces and venues, and because before then I was living in a rural part of Sydney, in a really in kind of the Bible Belt of Sydney, and very conservative, very monoculture, and then couple of nights a week starting to go out with friends, sneak out to the city and go to drag bars and see drag shows, and realizing the I guess I think of queer culture is like a really vibrant example of what folk culture and folk art and folk dance and folk costume can be, because it's all made up and tells the story of now, as well as being connected to a shared history and a shared lineage and a shared narrative that's from your chosen family and from community. And that was really important to me, because for so long I was completely detached and, you know, I guess knowing you're queer but running around the bush with a couple of German shepherds on your own, you're like, well, what is it? Am I queer now, here sitting on a big rock of sandstone with my 2 dogs? Like, or do I have to be in the city wearing particular clothing and going to nightclubs and you know, like in a relationship, and then I guess realizing through experiencing the same drag shows every Thursday night, every Saturday night or whatever, that these were these rich expressions of you know, and there were, and like tapping into pop culture as well, and, you know, miming songs and using songs to tell a story, you know, by Britney Spears or Cher or something like that, and realizing that we're all shared something through these songs, but could also be, I guess, interpreted in your own way. And I'm still really excited by that night, and then that's the thing that I want to. That's the thing that I've always wanted to communicate in my work, is that all of this is all made up, like, especially here in Australia, where, you know, unless you're a First Nation, you have a part of your story is how you've come here and how your family and you have changed by being here. And it's something that I'm looking to continue to celebrate. And I guess this is why I ended up working with community, because I realized I just couldn't say this on my own, like that it had to be a shared process. And I don't want to tell anyone else, like, that, you know, like everyone I think it's really important to be in control of your own narrative. I guess that's the thing. And so I don't want to tell anyone how to draw from or you know, I guess carry that narrative, but just hopefully always planting a seed and letting people know that it's alive, and and you know, culture, it's a living thing, and you and your identity and your relationship to your community is alive and is yours to add to in your own way anytime.
Thank you so much. There's so much joy in your practice, Liam. And I feel like that comes through community, and it's your viewpoint, but it's also the stories you're choosing to tell or how you're choosing to tell them.
Thank you.
I'm going to take a question and also remind Liam and Julia that you're welcome to ask each other questions if you have any questions that you'd like. But before then, I'll go to Belinda Hoden, who asks a question for Liam. Your work is always so wonderfully optimistic and hopeful despite facing at times difficult cultural issues. What tools do you use to keep the spaces and conversations open when working with a broad range of people from different life experiences to your own? It's a great question.
Yeah, thank you, Belinda. Lovely to have you here joining with us today. Yeah, it is really tough, and I think about it every day, all the time. And I guess one of the things recently this year that I've really come to terms with is being open to change and potentially making kind of mistakes, but just knowing that I'll actually, let's do that a little bit differently. So always staying in a state of moving forward with permission and with informing yourself as much as you can, but also knowing that you're going to be updating that foundation that you're making those decisions on now, and working and sharing space culturally. It's you know, I think especially being a white male as well, it's something I try and keep my finger on, but it's also hard for me to see. So you know, I do what I can. I listen to as many First Nation voices as I can, as many artists and writers and activists from different cultural experiences to me, to check in on my privilege and make sure that I am consistently, constructively engaged with that. And I guess recently as well with Adorned, I'm taking steps back from being a facilitator and for it being, it is now an artist collective. And so I guess I'm growing as an educator. So Adorned 5 years ago or 6 years ago when it started was Liam, the new educator, facilitating that program. And now it's very much participant led. So I have a space, I share it, we come here and hang out with the materials, but everything else has been the group's decision. And my role has been to just support each of those decisions. So those are some of the key values that I've been building on and trying to bring into our practice.
Thank you. I have another question for you, Liam. How do your textile costume works influence you in live performance work? Do they influence particular characters or highlight particular facets of yourself?
Well, I've only got one consistent drag character that I've been playing, and that's Tacky Motel. And Tacky's part of the Motel Sisters. So her sister, Paris Motel, who is played by the wonderful artist Naomi Oliver. And Tacky's clothes are a combination of off the rack, supre, what young people are wearing, and also her style is very much part showgirl, part active wear, like mum sipping a latte after Pilates. And so, and I think for her, and because she's a drag queen, she's not female identifying, and so I think when I play Tacky, it's really about making fun of our notions around gender and how gender is constructed, particularly in Western world and within the sort of sphere of consumerism and how we all respond to pop culture. But then for me as Liam, the things that I make for myself, the things that I bead and that I would wear are connected to that experience of going and spending time with queer community and thinking about, well, if I was going to make something for myself, what am I going to make? And always a notion of celebration, that those materials have been used as a way to face adversity and to, I love how the queer community has had so much adversity and actively, culturally, a lot of, when queer people get together, it's about saying we're really beautiful, we're fabulous, we're all about, love is at the core of who we are. So those things that I make for myself always, I want to contribute to that and continue highlighting the significance of, of those materials and how people are using them. Because I always say, like, one of the reasons I use sequins is because, a lot of people have had to gather in the dark at nighttime and hide in the shadows. And if you're going to do that, you might as well wear something that reflects the light. So that's always one of the reasons why I'm always using sequins as well.
Fabulous, thank you. Do you have any questions for each other?
Yeah, I'm really keen to know about, Julia, your relationship with dancing recently and the folk culture that you're tapping into, and what you're finding out about and how you're connecting to the costume and the fabrics and have you been dressed up in costume yet?
I haven't actually. In fact, it is this sort of weird thing of the sort of different cycles my life's been through, because as a kid I was, again, like a really avid kind of dress up player and sort of fantasy playing, all that sort of stuff. And then I you know, as I said, I started sewing when I was about 5, and my mum taught me, and she was making costumes for all of she was like a costume lady for the schools that she worked in, and so I would then help her do that. So I've made a lot of costumes in my life, and I think then I kind of popped out the other end feeling like I love these things as objects, but I don't want to wear them anymore. I don't want to kind of put them on myself, and I sort of have I think a kind of an inherent shyness about myself being in my practice, and you know, the kind of obvious thing would be to think about what these costumes look like to sort of wear and to perform in, but I'm just sort of really fascinated by what happens when I take myself out of that, and I let the objects do the work for me, or I let the sort of the sculptural kind of elements kind of perform for me, or become the kind of become the narrative themselves. So so costume has sort of been this sort of just, again, like a passion that kind of comes through it. In terms of the dancing, I mean, I just get way too sweaty to wear something nice in there. It's just like, it's really quite energetic, a lot of this dancing, and I often come home like red as a beetroot and feeling totally like, you know, energized but also really exhausted. But you know, I have over the years looked at a lot of folk costumes and the different kind of ways that they are constructed, and the amazing sort of fabrics that go into them, and they're just luscious, and they sort of feast for my eyes. But because I guess in my practice I draw from so many different, I look across cultures at all the different kind of connective rituals and ceremonies, I'm always really conscious that I don't just mimic those things, or I don't just kind of wantonly take from them. It's always, for me, I consider it I call it a kind of remote translation, whereby a lot of the things I'm really interested in, particularly the British rituals and ceremonies, I've never participated in them. I've only ever vicariously experienced them through watching YouTube or through research. So I like the fact that I do have that remoteness from them. I'm sort of really engage with them, but I kind of like that I have to translate it from afar through my own voice and through my own lens. And I like there's that kind of filter in the middle that I don't want to just replicate or just kind of copy things. I don't have the sort of right to do that. So I like to think, well, this is how I feel about it from where I am in my position in the world, and this is how I want to sort of translate it through my voice and through my lens. But I think that, you know, I have it's folklore and it's folk ritual, so you know, I'm a folk. I can engage in that in my own way. And I was interested when you were talking before about I guess what I consider the kind of currency of folk connection and community connection. You know, that sometimes when I'm researching these folk traditions, I look at how there are factions out there that want to keep the sort of historical aspects of folk traditions really tight, and other people who argue that just becomes historical reenactment instead of an active living thing. And I really think that I fall into that thing of thinking, yeah, it should be a living, pulsating thing, because it's enacted by people constantly. It originally was, why can't it be now? And why can't it sort of change to meet the needs of kind of current communities? And I think that currency is really important, and I feel like that's sort of something that you were as well touching on, in that how we can engage with it now is not for it to be like a stagnant, stale thing that you learn about and then you know about, but it's something that you evolve and grow and share, and naturally it's going to grow with other people having input and investment in it. So I don't know, maybe you would have talked to that a bit as well.
Oh yeah, well, I'm just thinking about the dancing that you're talking about, because of course maybe those dances were mostly done in cool climate countries and cool climate places, and yeah, like everyone would have been wearing heavy clothing and it would have been fine. But what does it mean now that we're dancing those here, and in summer, you know, what are we wearing, you know? And is it a t-shirt and a singlet? And if so, hey, that's great. That's now how it's evolving. Like my dad's kilt is really lightweight, and I tried to, when I got mine, I tried to get the same weight in woolen tartan fabric, and it's hard to get because I just don't think the kilt market is really thinking about Australians wearing kilts. But, you know, so I don't know, maybe, you know, actually what I'd really love is I'd love a kilt in a nice light cotton. But the problem is, you know, the weight of the fabric
Yeah.
is so important, and the swish of the pleats changes when, so I don't know, somebody's going to have to work on some innovative way of it being light and breathable but still have the same weight.
I think you want some curtain weights in the bottom of the cotton.
See,
What I was going to say.
great idea. That would work perfectly.
Yeah.
I once heard, like, on the red carpet, people sewing butter knives to the bottoms of their dresses so that it sat properly. So you just got to make it work, right?
Yeah, improvise, problem solving.
Yeah, that's so cool.
Love it. What are you both working on now? What have you got coming up?
You go, Liam.
Cool. I'll just take you to, my thought is mapping the unmeasurable. So I'm looking at ways of capturing emotions, memory, shared experiences, sensory experiences in relation to place, people, culture, and just, so this is an embroidery work that I'm working on at the moment. Yeah, and when I was doing, you know, with my photography work and performative, I would conceive the idea and then I would execute it. And so working with my materials at the moment is really organic and process driven. And so I'm just leaning into that as best I can. And yeah, so that's what I'm working on.
Do you have a show planned, Liam, or is that how you work, based on a deadline or a booked in showing, or do you work as soon as the ideas come to you?
Usually, and I need it because I'm such a terrible procrastinator. But my wonderful gallery that I'm represented by here, Arterial, they've said for me, the next one, we're just going to give you space and make before, and then when you have a collection, then we'll put on a show. Because I stress them out with trying to finish things in time. I've got a potential solo show coming up next year. But again, I'm actually saying no to things and stepping back and saying, I need more time.
Well, especially the medium that you work in is so labour intensive. And I think that's kind of an unspoken element within textiles in particular. And especially using embroidery, it's so time consuming. So how do you map that time out when you're looking at a deadline?
It's got to be, oh gosh, I was just forcing myself to sit down and clock hours. And I don't know about you, Julia, or any other makers who are here with us today, but I maybe only do like 2 or 3 hours at a time. And then I have to get up and move around because it's my back. It's like you're hunched over. And also, like, you just get into this vortex. Like, you might be listening to podcasts or music or whatever, but you can end up really like with your blinkers on, and so you just got to get outside into the world. But this summer, I'm going to just fill up my Audible account with great new books, and not say I'm going to go sit down and do embroidery. I'm just going to say, I'm just going to sit down and arrange my materials whilst I listen to this new audiobook and see what happens. Yeah, so taking the pressure off and and just seeing what happens when I do that, when I'm not working to a deadline.
Yeah, it sounds really good. How about you, Julia?
It's been harder to kind of get back into the rhythm following the demands of online teaching for a few months, earlier in the year. Obviously, we're back there now, but that sort of weird thing of, like, as I said about Beatrice and the biennial, it sort of felt like the resolution of a lot of things I've been thinking about. So I was kind of hungry and ready for like a new perspective, a new kind of body of work. And then that kind of coincided with the arrival of the pandemic, and it sort of made that a little bit harder to kind of process new things for me. So I have been sort of, just getting back into my daily studio practice, which is sort of, between 4 and 5 days a week in the studio. And perhaps not surprisingly, the things that I think about normally in my practice around cycles of seasons and around growth and decay and life and death, I guess I've been thinking a lot more about how we can't predict those things anymore, and the kind of, the problems we have with sort of, I guess when I think about the rituals I'm most engaged with, they're about encouraging the transitions of time. You know, we look to the new year, and we look to kind of, in the old days, we'd look to harvest, or, you know, we'd kind of have these counters, these sort of ticking over things that we would kind of respond to, and that we would try to encourage a new season, or a good winter, or a good summer, that sort of thing. And I'm sort of looking at the moment, thinking about how these things are interrupted, and how they're not kind of as reliable as we think they are, or that we can't kind of plan ahead so much, even though we kind of crave that. So yeah, I'm sort of thinking about uncertainty at the moment a lot, and yeah, sort of trying to process that in my own practice as well. So I do have a show coming up. It's quite late next year, but like Liam, you know, I have a laborious practice, and so I have sort of measures in my head of like how long a technique will take, and how much of it my body can take per day, before I hurt my back too much for the next week ahead. So yeah, sort of trying to manage all those different kind of making kind of zones, so that I don't accidentally do an 8-hour day of smocking and then realize that I can't move for another day. So yeah, just building in my own cycles within the bigger cycles, and hoping that they kind of sync up where they can, and then being reflexive and responsive to when they don't, and which we're all learning to do at the moment. So yeah.
Of course. Thank you so much. Well, that brings us to 2 o'clock. So I think we're going to round up our conversation, which has been so beautifully informative, and you've both been so generous and vulnerable. So I thank you so much for your time and your experiences today. A little round of applause from everyone.
Thank you, Debbie, and thank you, Liam. It's been wonderful talking to you.
Same, Julia. It's great. And thank you, Debbie, for facilitating this experience for everyone today. It's been lovely.